Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Where are you from? Recognize the member for Last Mountain, Touchwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure today to introduce to you and through you to all members of the Assembly a group of 36 students from the Cupar School. They are students from the grade 8, 9, and 12 classes. They are seated in the West Gallery, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Cupar students could give us a wave, because I believe there's another school group in the West Gallery. There they are. They are today, Mr. Speaker, they are accompanied by their principal, Mr. Bruce, their teacher, Mr. Tracklow, educational assistant, Ms. Dinsmore. They've already had the tour of the building. We had a very short meeting and the photograph on the grand staircase. There were some extra photographers that made sure we had a good picture, including the Minister of Social Services here. And I would ask all members to welcome the Cupar students to their assembly.
Recognize the member for Moosomin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, to all members of the Assembly, I'd like to introduce 17 grade 6 students from Rokenville. They're here today with their teacher, Mr. Jensen, and Mrs. Nadine Lowe, and educational assistant Debbie Logan, and probably the most patient of all, their bus driver James Calloway. I look forward to meeting them after question period today and have some questions from them. I'm sure they'll have some good questions for me. So I'd like all members to welcome them to their assembly.
Recognize a member for Prince Albert Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, I'd like to introduce a new constituent of mine, Mr. Surub Sood. He's seated up in your gallery. Thanks for the wave. In February of 2018, Mr. Sood and his wife arrived in Saskatchewan from Dubai and is currently working for the Prince Albert branch of the Royal Bank of Canada as a financial advisor. Mr. Sood was born to a Hindu family in the province of Punjab, India. Prior to moving to Prince Albert, Mr. Sood worked for 11 years as a financial advisor in Dubai. His previous work has taken him around the globe, including Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. We're very pleased to have him and his wife as new citizens of this province and of Prince Albert. Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, is now home to over 1,170,000 people, and that's a record high for our province. And a good portion of this growth is from newcomers like the Soods, who come to Canada and choose to call Saskatchewan home. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me to welcome Mr. Sood to his Legislative Assembly.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Kindersley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax on the province of Saskatchewan. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action: to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by citizens of Kindersley. I do so present.
Recognize the member for John of Rosemont.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present petitions on behalf of concerned citizens with the Sask Party government's elimination of the Saskatchewan Rental Housing Supplement. This really hurts those living on the tightest of budgets, on the margins, people living with disabilities, families with low wages, with children. Mr. Speaker, certainly they're calling for the reversal of this callous decision. And the prayer reads as follows. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately restore the Saskatchewan Rental Housing Supplement. And these petitions are signed by concerned residents from Regina. I so submit.
I got as a member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following. That Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those outside the province, to make unlimited donations to our province's political parties. And we know that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. And we know that Sask Party leader Brad Wall was the only premier in the country who collected a special cash bonus, a top-up, paid for by taxpayers, taxpayer-funded subsidies, and a portion of the millions in donations they collect from corporations and big money donors, including many from outside the province. We know, for example, Mr. Speaker, that over the past 10 years, the Sask Party has received $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.87 million came from companies outside of Saskatchewan, and that the federal government, the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and now British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan's campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from the city of Saskatoon, North Battleford, Melfort, and Regina. I do so present. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for critical workplace supports for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has the very dubious distinction of having the highest rates of intimate partner violence in Canada amongst all of the provinces, and we know we must do so much more to protect survivors of domestic violence. For those who experience domestic violence, often the violence will follow them to their workplace, which is why the signatories to this petition are calling for 5 days of paid leave and up to 17 weeks of unpaid leave be made available to workers who are survivors of domestic violence, and that critical workplace supports made available to survivors of domestic violence be also made available to workers living with PTSD as a result of that domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, this is what those who are on the front lines of this crisis, those who are working in transition houses throughout the province, are calling for, including PASS and the YWCA as two prominent organizations. They see the importance of ensuring that survivors of domestic violence are able to maintain their employment through their transition away from an unstable home to a more stable living environment. Mr. Speaker, this is what we're calling for in Bill number 609, the fourth time we put forward this provision in 2 years. It's time for the government to step up, do the right thing, and pass those provisions. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party to pass legislation to ensure critical supports in the workplace, including reasonable accommodation and paid and unpaid leave to survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing this petition today come from Regina. I do so present.
Hear, hear. Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today is the 25th anniversary of the International Day for Biological Diversity. Around the world, we celebrate the rich variety of life on Earth that is essential for the welfare and prosperity of people today and for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, protecting and restoring ecosystems and reducing deforestation, land degradation, and enhancing carbon stocks in forests, wetlands, rangelands, and croplands are needed for mitigating climate change. Mr. Speaker, today is also the first day of a week-long celebration in my hometown of Saskatoon, Nature City Festival put on by Wild About Saskatoon. Their goal is to foster a fresh, everyday connection between urban residents and the nature that envelops us. We want to nurture a civic culture where respect for the living world is routinely reflected in our collective and individual decisions. Mr. Speaker, a city is just not built, it's also planted. Saskatoon provides habitat not only for humans, but also for hundreds, maybe even thousands of species of plants, insects, birds, animals, from bumblebees to bats, from ducks to otters, and even the odd moose. Mr. Speaker, nature does not begin where the sidewalk ends. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join together as we mark this very special day, as we endeavour to act to protect the nature that sustains us. Our collective future depends on it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Westview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to rise today in this Assembly to acknowledge the success of Great Western Brewery in Saskatoon. The company announced today that they are expanding their premium product, Original 16, into the U.S. Mr. Speaker, there has been steady growth of the craft and import segment of the beer market in the United States, and the demand of quality products in premium and craft beer from Saskatchewan has been rising. Original 16 will look to take advantage of these trends and offer their diverse and delicious product to consumers right across the U.S. Mr. Speaker, this expansion will be executed in multiple phases, with the first focused on the southwestern states. The company will partner with No Limit Brands and Import Services and leverage great relationships as well as a highly regarded brand to appeal to U.S. consumers. Mr. Speaker, the craft alcohol industry continues to grow as more and more consumers recognize the quality of locally made Saskatchewan wine, spirit, and beer products. That growth will continue to help create jobs, grow tourism, and lead to other economic spin-offs right here at home. On behalf of this entire Assembly, I would like to congratulate Great Western Brewery on their expansion into the U.S. and wish them all the best in this endeavour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, on May 17th, the Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan hosted the Lady Justice Dinner and Fundraiser. This dinner is held every year to recognize women who are making a difference in their community. The Elizabeth Fry Society of Saskatchewan is a woman-centered nonprofit organization committed to working with women before, during, and after incarceration. It is the only organization in the province of Saskatchewan working specifically with adult women and their families involved with the criminal justice system. Programs and services offered by the Elizabeth Fry Society encourage an end to recidivism and support crime prevention through a social developmental approach. They are a community-based voice for women at risk, as well as those who are criminalized as a result of poverty, racism, histories of abuse, or a lack of education. The event featured a garden-side chat with Senators Kim Pate, Lillian Dick, and Mary Jane McCallum, who shared their insights on women's empowerment. Mr. Speaker, each year, Lady Justice Awards are presented to women who are making a difference in their community. The event aims to both recognize women's leadership in their communities and enhance public awareness and education regarding the circumstances of victimized and criminalized women in the criminal justice system. I would ask the Assembly to join me in congratulating the Elizabeth Fry Society for putting on yet another successful dinner. Thank you.
Recognize the member for Regina Rossdale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the week of May 20th to 26th has been proclaimed as Women Entrepreneur Week in Saskatchewan. This week recognizes the success of women entrepreneurs across the province and celebrates their contribution to our communities and to the economy. Saskatchewan women entrepreneurs contribute to the economy in many sectors, such as construction, manufacturing, health science, finance, and technology. Mr. Speaker, another announcement this month is the investment of Indigenous economic development in Saskatchewan by the organization Women Entrepreneurs of Saskatchewan. Women Entrepreneurs of Saskatchewan CEO Pava Mitchell highlighted investments of more than $300,000 for Indigenous Women Entrepreneur Program in Saskatchewan through Western Economic Diversification Canada and other funding sources. The Indigenous Women Entrepreneur Program was initiated by Women Entrepreneurs of Saskatchewan, and the capacity about the Indigenous women and to serve as a catalyst for economic growth in Indigenous communities. Investing in the capacity of Indigenous women to become successful entrepreneurs will help build a stronger and more inclusive economy in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the Women Entrepreneurs of Saskatchewan, as well as the Indigenous Women Entrepreneur Program, on this very significant investment. I would like to ask all members to join me in celebrating Women Entrepreneurs Week across the province. When women succeed, Mr. Speaker, we all succeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Cut Knife Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, each year the Saskatchewan Council for International Cooperation celebrates International Development Week. This year it was celebrated in early February in Saskatoon with the theme Partners for a Better World. As part of their celebrations, SCIC presented a small number of Global Citizen Awards to Saskatchewan residents who have shown their commitment to being a global citizen. 2 people were celebrated in Saskatoon, one being Marcella Peterson of Cutknife. Marcella has had a long dedication to ecological, human rights, and food sovereignty advocacy through the Church. Since 1974, she has been involved in the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace. This is one of the largest non-governmental organizations of the world and is part of an international confederation of 162 Catholic relief, development, and social services organizations, working on behalf of the poor and oppressed across the globe. In addition, Mr. Speaker, Marcella has also been active in other organizations with international reach, serving on the provincial boards for both the Catholic Women's League and the National Farmers Union. Mr. Speaker, I ask everyone in this Assembly to join me in congratulating Marcella on the Global Citizens Award and thanking her for all her selfless work and dedication to people everywhere. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Churchill Wildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new community health centre is set to open this fall at Market Mall in Saskatoon with a focus on people aged 50 and over. Mr. Speaker, this clinic is being established as part of our Connected Care strategy, a collaborative, team-based approach that ensures patients receive the care they need when and where they need it. It will provide care closer to home, outside of the traditional hospital setting. Mr. Speaker, the clinic plans to staff numerous professionals, including physicians, nurse practitioners, paramedics, social workers, occupational and physical therapists. On behalf of Strathhelen Capital Corp., Taylor Brown has stated that their vision, quote, continues to be transforming Market Mall into a community hub of sorts, offering an array of alternative services to the Saskatoon community, end quote. Mr. Speaker, the people of Saskatoon and the Market Mall area will be well served by this clinic, and so will our healthcare system as a whole. My constituency has the highest number of seniors per capita in the province, and thousands of seniors reside in the 2-mile radius around Market Mall. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members please join me in recognizing the new community health clinic set to open this fall in Saskatoon, and wish the new staff all the best in its opening and future operations. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Saskatchewan Rivers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was so pleased to attend the Saskatchewan Association of Architects annual general meeting and conference earlier this month. The meeting was held at Elk Ridge Resort in the beautiful boreal forest in my constituency of Saskatchewan Rivers. The Saskatchewan Association of Architects is a regulatory body which exists to ensure proficiency and competency of its members and to promote and increase knowledge related to the practice of architecture in Saskatchewan. This year's SAA conference explored how mid-sized cities offer a platform for interesting, unusual, or specific models of architectural practice. Questions for discussion from the conference included: how is local architecture made? How is the community being built? How do we make our mid-sized cities? And who benefits from this work? And what does it inspire? The conference featured an array of speakers and presenters from across North America, all in an effort to find better practices for designing mid-sized cities. Mr. Speaker, as a province consisting entirely of mid-sized cities and smaller, I have no doubt Saskatchewan architects learned something intriguing and had much to contribute to these discussions. I ask that all members of the Assembly join me in thanking the AGM organizers and all attending architects for their work in our province. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the member for Saskatoon-Nutana.
Here, 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 here. Mr. Speaker, in December 2013, the GTH purchased 204 acres of land from a Sask Party supporter for $21 million. Millions more than the government appraisal said it was worth. But the GTH didn't have the money to make that purchase until a deal from SaskPower arrived at just the right moment. Mr. Speaker, the then Minister for SaskPower, Bill Boyd, asked Cabinet to approve SaskPower's purchase of GTH land. That same month, the then Minister for the GTH, Bill Boyd, asked Cabinet to approve the GTH's purchase of Marquardt's land. Mr. Speaker, with Bill Boyd responsible for both the GTH and SaskPower, he didn't even need the member from Saskatoon-Willigo to strap on a sandwich board to help him make the sale. And now, Mr. Speaker, the land SaskPower bought in such a hurry sits empty, if you don't count the tumbleweeds. How can the minister justify the millions SaskPower spent at the GTH as power rates for people of this province keep going up and up?
Recognize the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, going back to approximately 2009, SaskPower was looking for options and land around the city of Regina to consolidate 27 different facilities spread out over a dozen actual physical properties in and around the city of Regina. Many of those facilities were built in the 1950s and 1960s. They're reaching the end of their useful life, Mr. Speaker. And so a number of options, over a dozen options were explored. In fact, 13 options were explored, and it was felt that the Global Transportation Hub was the best location for SaskPower's consolidation. There were some initial plans that were developed, but obviously with a changing fiscal time for the province, it was felt that now is not the time to proceed. SaskPower is looking at how to move forward with those plans, looking at the fact that the consolidation still needs to take place, Mr. Speaker, and I would expect over the coming months that the board will move forward with recommendations for plans.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, don't forget, on top of this expensive land deal, SaskPower also had to pay $8 million to move a transmission line just to make way for the GTH. It's no wonder that since the SaskPower government came in, people are paying 40% more on their power bills. Now, Mr. Speaker, since 2014, when Bill Boyd headed SaskPower, the land has sat idle, accumulating bills at the taxpayer's expense. Over that period, SaskPower has racked up an additional $4 million in costs, ranging from consulting fees, grants in lieu, and interest. The total bill for the land is now $29 million, and it continues to rise. But we hear these types of decisions are in the DNA of the Sask Party. So, Mr. Speaker, how much more is this GTH land deal going to cost SaskPower and the people of Saskatchewan?
Recognize the Minister of the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said before, going back to all the way to 2009, nearly a decade ago, SaskPower began to look for options to consolidate 27 facilities across the city of Regina over, I believe, 12 different sites in and around the city of Regina, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they looked at 13 different options and felt for a number of reasons that the Global Transportation Hub was the best option to pursue, Mr. Speaker, including the fact that it was the proximity to SaskPower's fiber optics cable network, the fact that it had good highway and rail access, as well as land that is owned by SaskPower on Highway 6, Mr. Speaker, is sitting on top of an aquifer, and that there were environmental concerns with pursuing that option. So, Mr. Speaker, SaskPower does intend to follow through with the consolidation, whether that be one consolidation or have a smaller footprint in the city of Regina over a smaller number of sites. But we felt over the last number of years it wasn't appropriate to move forward on this, but we look forward to moving forward on it.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, last week, in what was among the strangest answers I've received in this Assembly, the Minister of Justice responded to questions about the millions spent at the GTH with a tirade about dirt. But the minister buried the lead, Mr. Speaker. We're not worried about the dirt. We're worried about the millions of additional taxpayer dollars that have been lost in the GTH money pit. Now, in 2014, the former Minister of Highways, the member from Indian Head Milestone, decided to pay the GTH up front for the dirt, knowing that the use of the dirt wasn't his decision to make. That decision rested solely with the P3 conglomerate Vinci and Friends. Now, now that the Minister of Highways has confirmed that the dirt wasn't needed, there are some questions and concerns that arise. Maybe the current minister could shed some light on this. What has the former minister told him about this deal?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I answered a question last week. Highways purchased this land from the GTH for borough purposes in 2013. However, the quality of the material from other borough pits was unexpectedly good. I'm not an expert in dirt, as I'd indicated. So they didn't use the GTH land for the borough. As a result, the GTH will have to pay back the Minister of Highways the $2.86 million as future GTH land is sold. Mr. Speaker, right now it's a net sum. It's all an expense incurred by the taxpayer. It's money owing to the taxpayers, whether it's on the books of the GTH or whether it's on books of the Ministry of Highways. It's an expenditure that was made. It wasn't a legitimate expenditure that was made. Mr. Speaker, we make no intention of hiding it, masking it, whatever. It's there. We've shown it.
You're here.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon-Newtana.
Mr. Speaker, maybe it's because the Minister of Highways didn't get a legislative secretary that he can't answer these questions. His lack of knowledge about this multi-million-dollar throwaway is concerning. In fact, the flippant answers of the Minister of Justice on the wasted millions of taxpayers' dollars is almost inconceivable. It's this Sask Party government that is pushing people on the tightest of margins, people with disabilities, young families, out of the rental housing supplement to save $5 million, and then they scoff about the $6 million they wasted on dirt they haven't used. So to the Minister of Highways, why did his predecessor agree to such a flawed contract, and what is he doing to get that money back?
Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as was just said previously in the previous answer, Mr. Speaker, Ministry of Highways acquired the land for borough pits. The company that is doing the project on the Regina bypass did not need this land, as the product they used out of the other borough pits was far better.
I'm hearing the questions and the answers. Recognize the Minister of Highways.
Mr. Speaker, and they found the product in the other borough pits was far superior, so they didn't need to use the land that was acquired for the borough pit. As my colleague said in his answer previously, it's an asset that's holding there, and when GTH sells the land, the money will go back to Highways as a payback.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, nearly 10 years ago, the member for Regina Rochdale was the Legislative Secretary for Long-Term Care. She wrote up a public report, and in it she made some recommendations, some of which seemed like pretty good ideas. Quote, provide regional health authorities with targeted funding for home supports to bring Saskatchewan in line with the national average.
Good idea.
Quote, create a senior secretariat within the Ministry of Health. Unfortunately, after nearly a decade, we've seen very little progress made on these recommendations from the last time a legislative secretary's report was made public. Does the Minister of Health have any plans to act on these outstanding recommendations?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, certainly we take any recommendations such as that seriously. We've done a lot of work with seniors across the province, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I spoke at the seniors mechanism just last week. Mr. Speaker, as far as long-term care, we certainly have our challenges around the province. We inherited a massive infrastructure deficit on that, Mr. Speaker. We've built 12 long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker, on top of the numerous hospitals and other health care facilities. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, we take all recommendations like this very seriously, and we consider them within the budget every year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's disappointing that the minister won't commit to implementing the recommendations from the member of Regina Rochdale. But at least with her report, we know what she did. Exactly. We know what the recommendations were, and we can hold the government to account for their lack of progress on these recommendations. But over the last number of years, this government has moved the goalposts for legislative secretaries, and not for the better. Rather than presenting reports to the public for everyone to see, it seems that legislative secretaries aren't preparing much of anything at all. Our Freedom of Information requests for any reports or recommendations created by the legislative secretaries turned up nothing. On Friday, the government announced 13 new legislative secretaries. Will they have to produce public reports like the member from Regina Rochdale did? What accountability will there be to ensure they're actually doing work for the people of Saskatchewan?
As the Minister of Education.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the role of the legislative secretaries, Mr. Speaker, is to the role of the legislative secretaries, Mr. Speaker, is to help with public engagement on the government side, Mr. Speaker, so they can help inform the ministers, Mr. Speaker, with respect to policy development and moving agendas forward, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Education, I've relied on the work that was done by Legislative Secretary, the member from Churchill-Wildwood on curriculum development, Mr. Speaker, public report, the work that was done by former MLA Jennifer Campbell on bullying, Mr. Speaker. That was some work that we did some significant work on, Mr. Speaker, and that engaged in policy development on this side, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the legislative secretaries provide a valuable tool. And Mr. Speaker, my mother used to say, no, you shouldn't call the kettle black. When they were government, Mr. Speaker, they had legislative secretaries that paid for the full amount of the amount that was required under the rules, Mr. Speaker. A modest amount of $3,000, Mr. Speaker, to our legislative secretaries to help engage in public consultations, Mr. Speaker, to help guide public policy development is a good investment on this side of the House.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, if these legislative secretaries are going to be making recommendations to government, they should make these recommendations public. That's the transparent things to do. But at $3,000 apiece, that's $39,000 in total. It isn't a whole lot for the government with a budget of more than $14 billion, but it's...
Order, please. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you. But it's hard to justify when you consider how far that money could go in our communities. $39,000 could fund a full-time worker in a sexual assault center, or a full-time EA in one of our overcrowded classrooms, or provide mental health supports in the north. Is this really the best use of $39,000 when so many are hurting in our province? Is this really about topping up the salaries of government backbenchers to keep them in line?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, the legislative secretaries that were appointed last Friday will receive a $3,000 a year amount for the work that they're going to be doing, Mr. Speaker. And I can tell you on behalf of the Ministry of Education, that's going to be that'll be valuable work that the legislative secretary is going to be doing for my ministry, Mr. Speaker. Certainly engaging the public in ongoing consultation, Mr. Speaker, so that we can get a broad perspective, a broad view of what people in Saskatchewan, what our stakeholders are thinking, Mr. Speaker, is a valuable resource to the government of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. Contrary to the people on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker, who paid $12,000 for legislative secretaries, and I don't remember getting one public report or seeing one public report tabled on this floor of the legislature, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the work that they did.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, let's recap. There won't be any public reports, there won't be any accountability, and there's no commitment in completing the recommendations that have already been made. This is really about giving a $3,000 top-up to Sask Party backbenchers to keep them in line. For years, the Sask Party legislative secretaries did their work, if they did any at all. We don't really know. And only collected their MLA salary. But now we're seeing an ever-growing roster of legislative secretaries claiming an ever-growing pot of taxpayers' money to top up their MLA salaries. Will the minister finally drop his ruse? Will he go back to the Sask Party's old ways of doing things and scrap the practice of paying top-ups to legislative secretaries?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I've stood and answered this question twice. the work that the legislative secretaries are going to do to support the ministers of the Crown on this side of the House will be very, very valuable work, Mr. Speaker. And to the extent that the member opposite speaks to the fact that legislative secretaries haven't provided any value at all, Mr. Speaker, I commented on the work that the member from Churchill Wildwood did, Mr. Speaker, and we're incorporating the recommendations that she brought forward on curriculum development, something that the critic for education, Mr. Speaker, I think is very interested in, Mr. Speaker. And the bullying report that came out from MLA Campbell, Mr. Speaker, those are recommendations that this government has acted upon as well, Mr. Speaker. So to suggest that the work that's being done by these legislative secretaries, Mr. Speaker, is of no value, I take great exception to that, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll repeat the point. Never have I seen any report from the opposition when they were in government where they filed reports to the legislative secretaries who took a $12,000 top-up, Mr. Speaker, with regard to their income, Mr. Speaker. A $3,000 amount, Mr. Speaker, for the significant work that we're going to be requesting these legislative secretaries to do, Mr. Speaker, is a good investment for the taxpayers of this province.
As a member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Mr. Speaker, close to 100 long-term care residents will need to be relocated from their homes in Pioneer Village. This story is heartbreaking, but it certainly isn't surprising. For years, the Sask Party government has known that repairs and upgrades were needed. At this facility where there has been a boil water advisory, asbestos remediation, elevators out of service, the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, it is clear that the situation at Pioneer Village is critical. The impacts on residents, their families, and the staff are significant. With no action from the Sask Party government to this point and no funding for a new facility in this year's budget, can the minister explain how this situation is going to be fixed?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're very concerned about this issue. Regina Pioneer Village was inherited by this government from the city in 2009. It had significant maintenance problems, Mr. Speaker. Since that time, we spent in the neighborhood of $12 million on it to mitigate issues. Mr. Speaker, recently we were aware of a significant mold issue that's gotten worse. Mr. Speaker, we want to ensure that all residents are safe. SHA officials are in the process of placing the 94 residents that the member opposite is speaking of in other facilities, Mr. Speaker. That's imperative. Meanwhile, I've asked officials from both the Saskatchewan Health Authority and from the Ministry of Health to provide some recommendations on where we go next, Mr. Speaker. I expect that report this summer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Saskatoon Riversdale.
Mr. Speaker, the minister's words will mean little to the people relying on these services who have watched this facility fall apart for years. One resident said, and I quote, "I just don't feel safe. Someone is going to get hurt." Mr. Speaker, residents and families are rightfully worried, and with one of the largest long-term care facilities no longer accepting patients, more stress will be added to our already taxed healthcare system. With more people waiting for long-term care, overcapacity issues and waits at hospitals will only get worse. Mr. Speaker, the minister has to stop spinning his lines and realize that people are suffering now and tell us what the plan is for Pioneer Village.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister isn't spinning his lines. I very clearly indicated what the go-forward plan is on this, Mr. Speaker. We're extremely concerned about the residents. We're making sure that the SHA officials do everything they can to make the transition for our residents as seamless as possible. Mr. Speaker, but let's put this in perspective. If she wants to talk about spinning lines, we inherited a massive infrastructure deficit. We have spent over about $1.5 billion in significant capital and capital maintenance projects since we formed government in healthcare, Mr. Speaker. And you want to talk specifically about long-term care. Mr. Speaker, under the members opposite, 19 long-term care facilities in this province were closed. Mr. Speaker, under this government, 12 have been built. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, last week I asked the Minister of Justice to ensure that sexual assault services weren't cut because of funding shortfalls. He said, and I quote, "We are in a process of finalizing budget, dealing with a number of issues on this. We recognize the challenges that exist." But what we didn't hear from the minister was a straight answer with a commitment for funding. Well, Mr. Speaker, it isn't just Meadow Lake, Isle Cross, and the Battlefords area that are losing services. The Saskatoon Sexual Assault Centre had to cut their hospital support program for victims of sexual assault. So if the minister knows these challenges exist, why isn't he providing the funding to address them?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, we appreciate the very valuable work that's done by those agencies. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with them. We realize we're in budgetary constraints, but Mr. Speaker, we do provide substantial funding for them. Battlefords and Area Sexual Assault Centre, $233,740. Lloydminster Sexual Assault and Information Centre, $102,700. Regina Sexual Assault Centre, $234,830. Saskatoon Sexual Assault and Information Centre, $181,610. Saskatoon Sexual Assault and Information Centre, Inc., which is the support for adult survivors, $218,760. Society for the Involvement of Good Neighbours, $117,800. The Prince Albert Mobile Crisis Unit Cooperative Limited, $111,010. Mr. Speaker, more work to do, and Mr. Speaker, we respect and value their work and will continue to work with them.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, the Sask Party like to say that this is a priority, but Saskatchewan remains the only province without a sexual assault strategy. And none of this government's talk is backed up with action. Important services are being cut. In Saskatoon, sexual assault reports to police have increased by 30% in the last 5 years, and demand for support programs have increased as well. But funding for services has remained flat for years. There is nothing here for the minister to be proud of, and for him to quote those numbers as if that's a good thing is shameful. Mr. Speaker, this issue is too important to be addressed with empty words from the Sask Party. Will the minister commit today to ensuring that the services cut will be restored?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, the issues of domestic violence, the issues of sexual assault are something that's important to everybody that's in this House, and they're things that we need to continue to work through, develop plans, develop strategies. Mr. Speaker, with regard to this area, we've made changes to allow people to break leases. We've allowed for unpaid days off at work. We've have consultation underway with regard to Clare's Law, which will give the police the opportunity to maybe preempt an act of violence before it occurs. We've allowed for legal advice to be given to people on an ongoing basis. And Mr. Speaker, we're the only government that's introduced another outreach centre or another transition house since 1989.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Speaker, I don't know what I need to do to get the minister to change his lines. Sexual assault strategy is very important. Domestic violence strategy is very important as well, but the two are not necessarily the same. The minister should not be quoting supports for survivors of domestic violence when we're talking about sexual assault. So I'm going to ask a question that I asked before that he did not answer one more time. Will the minister commit today to ensuring that the services cut from sexual assault centres will be restored?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'd indicated earlier that we want to work with those agencies. We want to make sure that we've got a good, cohesive plan as we go forward. And Mr. Speaker, those are things that we intend to do. The work that is done by the sexual assault centres and the transition houses in our province, and I agree with the member opposite, you can't intermingle them, but the fact is a lot of the services are delivered by the same service providers. And Mr. Speaker, we want to continue to look after and do the best thing that we possibly can to ensure that those services are continued. We realize that in our province we do have an ongoing problem, and we want to make sure that we do everything that we possibly can to make sure that those agencies are adequately funded, that we look to make sure that we're not duplicating resources, that we look at the best models for service delivery. And once again, Mr. Speaker, I want to make sure that I reiterate the thank yous that we have for those people. The sexual assault centres have asked for a further meeting. We've agreed to that meeting, Mr. Speaker, and we'll just see where we go as we go forward, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member for Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan's job market continues to be in recession, and this government has offered no solution. The April job numbers showed a decrease of 1,800 jobs, and the government has no plan to create jobs, and all they're worried about is balancing their mismanaged budget. Instead of helping the people of Saskatchewan find work, they cut saskjobs.ca to make it even harder for them, a decision they quickly reversed, proving once again that this government is more of the same, short-sighted and reactionary. Mr. Speaker, my question is, when will this government deliver a plan for creating jobs in a diverse economy instead of burying their heads in the sand and cutting from programs designed to get people back to work?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact is that this province has one of the best job creation records in the entire country over the course of the last decade. Over 62,000 jobs have been created in this province, Mr. Speaker, the second highest rate of job creation in the entire country versus their record, which was dead last over their last 10 years in government, Mr. Speaker. But one of the most important issues, pressing issues facing the country right now has to do with the Kinder Morgan pipeline, Mr. Speaker. They have had literally nothing to say on the issue, Mr. Speaker. They've been hiding under a pile of coats. But one of the NDPers, one New Democrat who hasn't been hiding under a pile of coat, is their federal leader. And let me read to you, Mr. Speaker, what he tweeted, his position on this issue. Quote, "Liberals are giving Texas oil company Kinder Morgan a blank check while dumping all the risks on Canadians' rigged process. First Nations and local communities shut out. Oil spill threat science ignored. Billions on the line. It's clear this pipeline should not be built." That's the position of their federal leader, Mr. Speaker. On this side of the House, we'll stand up for the economic interests of this province and this country. We will fight for this pipeline. We wish they would do the same.
Why is the member on her feet?
Order, Mr. Speaker. Point of order.
Sorry? Sorry, why is the member on her feet?
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
What's your point of order?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to Rule 52, I'm simply asking, the Deputy Premier had referenced in his answer some recommendations from a document from when the former member from Saskatoon Fairview and the member for Saskatoon Wildwood were legislative secretaries. Some recommendations were made. We are asking that they please table those documents. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, under Rule 52, you must have. Right, the minister had to quote the document. You're not obliged to table a briefing note, but I'll tell you what. Voluntarily, I'll review. Be happy to review, and we'll report back. Thanks. Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
Written questions. Question number 286 asked by Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the answer to question number 286.
Table 286. Recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the committees may continue their good work today. I move that this House do now adjourn.
Government House Leader has moved the adjournment of the House. Pleasure to Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House stands adjourned until 1:30 tomorrow.